All right. Hi, everyone. So, goal for the video, aside from learning about the 1920s, which we've titled as Change and Conservatism, is to keep it under 50 minutes. Can I do it? Time will tell. I have faith. I hope you do as well. So, we'll get right into it. The 1920s are a fantastic decade to study, bookended by two major events in American history. World War I ends 1918. The peace takes through 1919, and that essentially starts the 1920s. And then the Great Depression sets in with the stock market crash in 1929. So the 1920s as a decade really do exist in some ways in isolation between these two very large events. One of the things that the 1920s are remembered for is in this country is economic prosperity. Now, immediately after the war, there is a recession. And we see this a lot of times when, especially large wars end, the economy has to revert back to a peacetime economy. So transitioning from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy can often be bumpy. People are losing jobs, jobs are being shifted around. There are people looking for jobs who are being discharged from the military. All of this can lead to economic uncertainty and can lead to, like I said, a bumpy time. So we see this post-war recession, 1920, 1921, but very quickly we see a recovery, and not just a recovery, the American economy takes off. There are a couple factors here. The American economy by the early 20th century was already the most powerful industrial economy in the world, and the 1920s is just going to continue to grow. So that's one of those factors. Another factor is that a lot of competition that America had been facing prior to World War I economically had been hurt by the war. So the British, for example, are focusing on rebuilding. The French are focusing on rebuilding. They're having problems with their colonial empires as well. Russia is experiencing a civil war. And even once that ends, Russia is focusing inward, the new Soviet Union. So there's very little competition, industrial competition, and that leads to a period of prosperity in the United States. One of the things that the 20s is remembered for, and this is an outgrowth of the progressive era, is scientific management and the standardization of a lot of business practices. And the person you want to associate with this is Frederick Taylor. So Taylor is a pioneer of scientific management. Sometimes this is referred to as Taylorism. In this course, we usually refer to it as scientific management, but either is fine. Oh, one other note. So you have access to these slides in your schedule, the Unit 3 schedule, and we've started adding links to the slides. So if you want to use these slides to learn more about the topics that we're talking about, because we do go through these things somewhat quickly sometimes, anytime you see a link, that is a link to a resource for you to learn more. So what Taylor is arguing here is that if you want to increase industrial output and industrial productivity, you need to make the industrial process as scientific as possible. And you can see his framework here, as it were. This is a big progressive thing. We talked about this in class in Unit 1, is the idea of efficiency and improving efficiency, taking scientific means and applying them to economics and society. Scientific management is a double-edged sword, especially for workers. It can increase wages. You can see one of the principles of scientific management is pay based on results. The idea that if you work more, you work harder, you produce more, you can get more money. That's attractive to some workers. But for the most part, labor is going to see scientific management as a negative. Since we're standardizing the process, we're really turning workers into robots. Taylor and his adherents are timing tasks. They are making very specific rules for the factory floor for how long it should take a worker to do each job. And if the worker falls behind, then that worker is problematic in some way. So it really does dehumanize the process of industrial production even more than industrial production had already done. What we see during the 1920s, scientific management is a part of this, but also the politics, which we'll talk about at the end of the slideshow, are a big part of this as well, is that business is booming and big business is doing well. The Gilded Age in the late 19th century is the age that we usually think of when we associate economic prosperity with monopolies and very large trusts and cartels. The 1920s also are, in some ways, the last gasp of the Gilded Age. We see low interest rates. We see regulations being relaxed, these regulations that had been put in place during the Progressive Era. Sorry, I got my alarm going off. These regulations are not going away necessarily, but they are being lessened during the 1920s. There's this feeling that the progressives, in some cases, went too far and were a little bit too zealous. And there's a political and economic mood around that in the 1920s. So we don't see this regulatory impulse that we saw during the Progressive Era. Another thing that's helping with economic prosperity is consumer spending. During the war, there was not a lot of consumer spending. There was not a lot of money to go around. Millions of American men were being drafted into the American military, and so they weren't spending money. Also, the industrial economy was producing wartime goods. It wasn't really producing consumer goods. By the early 1920s, there's a lot of pent-up consumer demand because of that. Couple this with the fact that there's a lot of really cool new inventions and things to spend our money on, which we'll talk about, I think, on the next slide, but coming up. It leads to this big increase in consumer spending in the 1920s, and that's going to fuel a lot of this economic prosperity. Of course, we can't talk about the 1920s without talking about the car. There are a couple pieces of technology that are synonymous with the 1920s, which you should associate with the decade in your mind. The car is probably the most important of those, although I'll give you two others later on. The car is going to reshape America. It's going to reshape America economically, culturally. It's going to reshape the American landscape. America is a car culture. And since really post-World War II, not post-World War I so much, but post-World War II, America has committed itself to car ownership. We do not have very good public transportation. We have a huge network of roads, and we are very spread out. And this is because in the 1920s, cars become extremely affordable. Henry Ford is the American entrepreneur who makes cars affordable. When the Model T comes out in the early 1900s, I shouldn't say Model T, I don't know if it's a Model T, but when early Ford models are produced in the first decade of the 1900s, they cost about $30,000 in today's money. So if we were to go buy a Ford car in 1908, we would be paying the equivalent of $30,000, which is kind of what you can get a car for today in the 21st century. By the 1920s, cars had become significantly cheaper. So this is one of the Model Ts right here, the Runabout. This is the cheapest one, $260. If we adjust that for inflation, we're talking about around $5,000. So imagine going out today and buying a new car for $5,000. It's just not possible. The average price for a car today is somewhere around $40,000. You cannot get a new car for $5,000. So Ford made the car affordable, and he did this through principles of scientific management and standardizing the process, and it revolutionized the country, and it revolutionized certainly car ownership in the country. There is an economic downturn in 1928, and indeed the farming sector is starting to struggle even earlier. There are signs of problems with the farming sector in the mid-1920s. The economy starts to dip in 1928, but most people say that it's nothing to worry about. We'll come back to that next unit. So next, we'll talk about labor unions. During the 1920s, labor union membership actually declined. And this shouldn't surprise us too much. Labor unions exist to protect workers. And when workers don't perceive the need for protection, labor union membership typically is not in demand. And that's the 1920s. Jobs are plentiful, pay is high, people are doing well economically. Labor unions are seen as unnecessary or superfluous. So we see the decline of labor unions because of that. Another reason why we see the decline of labor unions is because the American people begin to view labor unions as quite radical. I say begin, but labor unions had been viewed as radical since the late 19th century. Labor unions had been known for strikes and walkouts and violence and disorder. We layer something in the early 1920s to this fear, which is communism. So the Soviet Union becomes a thing in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. And the rhetoric coming out of the Soviet Union in the 1920s is about worldwide revolution. Workers of the world unite, overthrow your capitalist oppressors, and communism should exist everywhere. This scares Americans greatly. And so these labor unions, which prior to 1917 had maybe looked scary, had looked like they supported chaos and disorder, now all of a sudden it looks like they are supporting revolution. I don't want to overstate it because labor unions were talking about revolution prior to the Soviet Union's emergence in 1917. I think a lot of Americans didn't really believe in the possibility of a true like socialist communist revolution. Once they saw it happen in Russia in 1917, all of a sudden it becomes a much more possible fear as far as many Americans are concerned, which this cartoon makes clear. The idea that strikes are going to eventually lead to Bolshevism, as it was called at the time, so communism, and possibly revolution, was something that most Americans hadn't entertained prior to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. Now, all of a sudden, it looks like a possibility. This is going to lead to the demonization of labor unions, and in some cases, the criminalization of labor unions. The other thing that happens immediately after the war is that there's a spasm of strikes after the war. A big reason for this is because during the war, wages had been frozen. It was seen as unpatriotic to request more money for the work that you were doing while American men were off fighting or were getting ready to fight in the war. So for about 2 years, 1917, 1918 into 1919, wages had been frozen. Meanwhile, labor had been asked to work harder, work longer hours for that patriotic war effort. Now in 1919, as the war ends, labor is going to say, well, you owe us some money. And not only do you owe us some money, you owe us back pay, essentially. You owe us for 2 years of having no increase in wages. And so we see this wave of strikes across the country. These strikes don't work, generally speaking. Some of them do, of course, but for the most part, they don't work. Certainly they don't work like they were working in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. There's a couple reasons for that. One of the reasons is because the courts, which are conservative throughout the country, are stepping in and issuing injunctions, basically telling the people you have to go to work or you are going to be treated as criminals. You're going to be arrested. You're going to be fired from your jobs, whatever it may be. Also, because we're layering in this fear of communism, the strikes are not supported to the same extent that they were. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many strikes were successful because of the sympathy that the local communities had for the strikers. They would support the strikers. They would bring them food. They would close their shops as well in a show of solidarity with the strikers. A lot of this stuff is not happening in 1919 and in the 1920s because there is this fear that is really spreading due to the takeover of communism in the Soviet Union. I already mentioned this before, so I won't belabor the point, but many workers are seeing less of a need for labor unions because they're getting paid relatively well. We also see the increase in what are called open shops. Open shops are conditions where employers will make sure that they hire workers who are not joining labor unions. They do this through a number of ways. Eventually, post-World War II, we're going to start to get open shop laws in certain states. We don't have that yet in the 1920s, but employers are moving towards the goal of having open shops. Employers are just less willing to deal with labor unions and are more willing to take drastic actions against labor unions in the 1920s. One thing I already mentioned, but is like a huge part of the 1920s, is that new technology that we see. I already mentioned the car, and I said that I think when we're talking about technology, the car is probably the most important one, maybe the most, has the biggest impression, the biggest impact. I think you could make a strong case, however, that the radio is number one. I put the car at number one, but I think you can argue convincingly that the radio was the most important piece of technology in the 1920s. All these pieces of technology were invented before the 20s. During the 20s, they become ubiquitous, like they're everywhere. So radios, you can see 50% of US homes have a radio by 1931, and radio ownership is going to go up even throughout the 1930s during the Great Depression, a time when people are struggling to survive. By the time we get to the end of the 30s, I think radio ownership is over 90%. Radio is one of those pieces of technology that is actually invented during the 1920s. The first radio broadcasts are in 1920. So you see this remarkable growth in 11-year time period. It goes from something that didn't exist to something that 50% of Americans own and increasingly see as essential. Because what the radio allows for is it allows for connection. Before the radio, you did not have any kind of mass media that could reach Americans as far away as the radio could and instantaneously like the radio could. You had mass media in the form of newspapers, for example, but newspapers were not circulated very far afield from where they were published. And also newspapers were slow. They were daily, which at the time was pretty fast. But once the radio comes around, now you have instantaneous or close to it communication. And the radio is not just for music, which is kind of what we think about when we think about the radio today. The radio was everything. It was news, it was plays, it was dramas, it was quiz shows, it was comedies, it was sporting events. It was the way that Americans increasingly came to interact with the world outside of their small communities. It was the centerpiece of the American home. You can see in this image 3 women who are gathered around the radio. And this was a very typical thing by the late 20s and especially the 1930s, where families would gather around the radio and they would watch the radio. It was life altering for Americans. It really did make them feel like they were a part of a much larger country and a much larger world. So it really can't be overstated how important the radio was to American life. Movies also are pretty closely associated with the 1920s. Movies had been around prior to the 20s, but they come of age in the 20s and 30s. We have the first talkies in the 20s. The Jazz Singer is the first movie that has integrated sound. 1926, 27. You guys can fact check me on that, somewhere around there. Movies are another medium that is going to actually increase throughout the 1930s. People are going to be spending their money to go to the movies, even at a time when money is quite scarce. And the 20s, you see more theaters that are popping up, more movie theaters that are popping up. These theaters are beautiful. They're elaborate. They're huge. They don't look anything like the movie theaters that we have today. Also, most of them weren't multiplexes like today. Movie theaters, you have like 20 theaters in a building. Then they were singular, but they were impressive and ornate and beautiful. The 1920s is sometimes referred to as the Jazz Age. I think that is I think that's Fitzgerald who coins that term. Again, you can fact check me on that. But jazz, which is sometimes referred to as the first American art form, becomes an incredibly popular form of music, and it spreads internationally. And this is why it is often considered the first American art form, because there are other cultures that are adopting jazz and are interested in jazz. And it is a Black art form. It grows out of the South, the rhythm and blues, and it is pioneered by Black musicians. And it is a very important thing culturally and racially in American history. We'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide with the Harlem Renaissance. But jazz, for acceptance of Black Americans, at least in a small way, is important. The phonograph makes listening to music a little bit more accessible. The phonograph is less important than the radio, but I always try to mention it in the 1920s, basically early record players. Cars we already mentioned, but airplanes we haven't talked about. Airplanes have been around for about, the Wright brothers are early 1900s, 1903. So airplanes by the early 1920s, 15, 20 years, something like that. Airplanes are becoming more popular. They're becoming larger, slightly safer, but not quite yet. Airplanes are the ultimate world shrinking technology as Americans and people around the world see them. Nothing symbolizes this more than Charles Lindbergh's journey across the Atlantic, the first person to fly solo successfully across the Atlantic. And this is just, it's throughout the 1920s, people are trying to do it. Many, many people die trying to do it. They crash into the Atlantic Ocean and are never seen again. It's an incredible feat of human achievement. It was over 30 hours to fly from New York to Paris, where he eventually landed. And it symbolized to many around the world the new possibilities, a journey that would have taken 6 weeks 100 years prior now takes 30 hours. That's incredible. And so airplanes, which are really going to be like more of a post-World War II thing, especially when we're talking about passenger air travel, airplanes in the 1920s are also very closely linked. So here we go. I mentioned the Harlem Renaissance. Before we get there, we'll talk a little bit more broadly about American culture. The 1920s, for as much prosperity and revelry and joy and excitement as there is also a foreboding, a darkness in the 1920s that some Americans, some Westerners feel. And this has a lot to do with World War I. There are a decent number of people coming out of World War I who are deeply depressed by what they have experienced, literally, if they were experiencing the war, but also figuratively in seeing these supposedly civilized societies ripping themselves apart and killing millions of people. The idea of progress, that Western civilization had been progressing for a long time throughout the 19th and into the early 20th centuries and would continue to progress, was something that was questioned by a large number of cultural critics. And so the 1920s is also known for this group of writers who are sometimes referred to as the Lost Generation. And we still read these people today. They are still considered some of the great masters of the American literary movement. Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, T.S. Eliot. They are creating some of the most widely read and disseminated American novels in history. And a lot of their novels share the same themes of really deep questioning, really deep concern for America. The Great Gatsby is a great example of this. How real is this prosperity? What does this culture actually stand for? These are questions that the writers are asking themselves. Some of these people are so disillusioned with America that they leave and they move to Paris and they create a pretty vibrant expat community in Paris. And so we also have to remember this aspect of the 1920s, that there are some who are looking around and they are saying, all that glitters is not gold, that this is not real. And what Americans are chasing is a false prosperity. They are abandoning their core beliefs for riches and a quick buck and hedonistic enjoyment. And so that's the Lost Generation. On the more positive side, we have musical theater. Talk about Rodgers and Hammerstein, the Gershwins, George Gershwin, Ira Gershwin. Broadway is starting to become the thing we know it as today, and we see some of the great musicals that we still put on in high schools around the country. Oklahoma, The Sound of Music. There are many others. Porgy and Bess, which is an opera, that's the Gershwins. These are all being created in the 1920s, early 1930s, and are still put on today and still celebrated as great works of American musical theater. One of the things that the College Board talks about, or I should say asks about on the exam all the time, is the Harlem Renaissance. There are some significant changes going on within Black America and Black American communities. Now, these changes had been going on prior to World War I in something that's referred to as the Great Migration. In the first, let's say 40 to 50 years of the 20th century, there are large numbers of Black Americans who are fleeing the Deep South, and I do use that word purposefully. They are trying to escape a very dangerous and increasingly horrible situation in the Deep South, where Jim Crow has cemented itself, and Black Americans are not just second-class citizens, but their lives are in danger. So they are leaving for industrial centers in the North. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York. And by the 1920s, a number of African Americans have created fairly large communities within these northern cities, the most famous of which is Harlem in New York City. What we see in Harlem during the 1920s is this explosion of Black culture, pride, the arts. This is where we get a lot of jazz music from, as an example, but we also have poets, we have writers, we have artists. Harlem becomes the epicenter for a very short time, second half of the 1920s into the early 1930s, for Black cultural life. In some cases, we don't want to overstate it too much here, because of course there are many other vibrant Black communities throughout the country. But Harlem is one of the largest, and it's one of the most renowned. You have this really interesting situation in the second half of the 1920s where you have relatively wealthy white Americans who live in and around New York who are traveling to Harlem to pay money to listen to Black musicians who are dancing to Black music performed by Black artists. This is not nothing. Black Americans are still going to be treated as second-class citizens, and we don't want to overstate the amount of acceptance that they are gaining out of the Harlem Renaissance. But we do have, for a short time, a inversion of the racial hierarchy in a very small place in very specific situations. Again, please listen to my words carefully, because I don't want to overstate it here. But you have this element of Black acceptance. We need to hold on to that because it's going to empower certain Black communities to demand more acceptance. And this is where we get things like the Universal Negro Improvement Association, run by Marcus Garvey. Now, Garvey is going to be arguing that the key to acceptance is actually to leave. So different than what we are seeing with this acceptance in Harlem. But nevertheless, Garvey and others like W.E.B. Du Bois are feeling empowered by what they are seeing, which are these vibrant, thriving Black communities. Now, how those Black communities go about getting full acceptance is where people like Garvey and Du Bois split and differ. But the key, in my opinion, is understanding that these Black communities do begin to feel empowered to demand rights, acceptance, a place, either in America, in American society like the NAACP, or elsewhere by leaving the country. We'll talk more about this when we get to the civil rights movement later, but it's an important moment in the early civil rights movement, is the Harlem Renaissance. One of the other things that the 1920s is known for, and the College Board loves to ask about this as well, is the fight that we are seeing between an increasingly modern, industrial, urban country and a historically rural, conservative, traditional country. We see this fight play out in a number of places and areas. One of the ways that we see this is in gender norms. In the 1920s, if you think about the 20s, and especially the jazz age, urban city aspect of it, you probably think of the Flappers. Whether knowingly or not, the Flappers were young women who were challenging gender norms at the time. They were dressing scandalously, as you can see in this picture, quite scandalous. They were doing things that were not seen as appropriate for women who were, acceptable, high society. They were wearing makeup. They were going on unchaperoned dates. They were wearing revealing clothes, ostentatious jewelry, short hair. These are all things that the Flappers were doing in an attempt to challenge the norms of the day. Another area where we see this play out is in religion and the role of religion. There's no better example of this than the Scopes trial. This is one you should absolutely know for the APUSH exam. The Scopes trial is this really fascinating case in Tennessee, in a small town of Dayton, Tennessee, in 1925, where this teacher, John Scopes, is accused of teaching evolution, which was illegal in Tennessee at the time. Now, Scopes had done this on purpose to challenge the law with the help of the ACLU, I want to say, and was brought to trial. And it became a media circus. It became a nationwide fascination because it wasn't just a trial about the teaching of evolution. It was a trial about the role of religion in our lives, in the classroom. What are we going to believe? Are we a Christian, Bible reading, God fearing country, or are we this modern scientific country instead? The outcome of the trial doesn't matter too much. Scopes is found guilty because, of course, he did break the law, and he was fined, I think, like $100, which was, a couple of $1,000s at the time. But the case outcome is not what's significant here. What's significant is it demonstrates that America is thinking about what kind of a country it is and what kind of a country it wants to be. Does it want to be the type of country that has laws against teaching evolution, for example? Does it want to be a country that privileges religion over science, for example? This is not anything new, and it is something that will continue up until our lives. We still have these debates today. The Scopes trial is just one of those moments in time that crystallizes very clearly in the minds of Americans what this debate looks like and what the stakes are. Of course, Prohibition is going on during this time, during the 1920s. Kind of easy to forget because everybody was drinking. At least that's the way it seemed. Prohibition went into effect 1919, 1920. The amendment was passed in 1919. I think it might have gone into effect in 1920 with the Volstead Act. And throughout the 1920s, drinking was illegal. In fact, drinking does go down. It seems like everyone is drinking during the 1920s because of how the era is portrayed. But drinking overall did go down. It was just harder to get alcohol. What we see, however, is that the problems associated with drinking are still there. Many people had wanted prohibition because they viewed alcoholism and its effects as a negative thing for American society. And that was and remains the case. Prohibition creates some new problems, namely the rise in organized crime. Americans still wanted alcohol, and they were going to find ways to get it. And if alcohol was illegal, that meant that Americans had to break the law. And they had to find people who were willing to break the law for them. And this is where we get the rise of organized crime. And some really famous people like Al Capone, who are going to become fabulously wealthy off of prohibition and running liquor illegally, bootlegging as it was called, and through running illegal bars and clubs called speakeasies. So this is why by the late 1920s, most Americans view prohibition as a failure. Yes, drinking goes down, but the problems that it caused in their minds outweighed the benefits. And so eventually, pretty quickly, prohibition is repealed. And I say pretty quickly because amendments are hard to get passed. And to have an amendment passed in 1919 that is then repealed just 14 years later shows the amount of anger around prohibition. It was seen as a failure, as an abject failure. When we think about the 20s, we should also think about intolerance, because the 20s in America is a very xenophobic time, a very nativist time, when there is a rampant fear of others and foreigners. The quota laws go into effect in the early 1920s. One of the concerns that some Americans had, especially coming out of World War I, and with that context of the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union, is that immigration has gotten out of control. Throughout the 1900s and the 1910s, immigration had been going up seemingly exponentially, not literally exponentially, but that's what it seemed like to Americans. Indeed, more immigrants came to the country between 1900 and 1920 than ever before. So there's this push to limit immigration in the United States, and it manifests in two laws. In 1921, there is a quota that is passed that limits the amount of an immigrant population allowed into the United States to 3% of that country's immigrant population that is already in the United States. So I'll give you an example. Let's say there are 100,000 Italians, according to the 1910 census, who are in the United States. What that means is every year after 1921, we will only let in 3% of that number. So 3,000 Italians. Now, I made those numbers up. There were probably more Italian immigrants here than 100,000, but you get the idea. So 1922, 3,000 Italians would be admitted. After that, no more. 1923, 3,000 Italians. After that, no more, because it was based on the 1910 census. That number didn't change until a more restrictive law was passed just 3 years later. Notice it goes down from 3% to 2%, and it goes from the 1910 census to the 1890 census. Now, why do you think they changed the census here? Because there were fewer immigrants in the country in 1890 than there were in 1910. So if we take that made-up number of 100,000 Italian immigrants here in 1910, there may have been only 50,000 that were here in 1890. So once again, limiting the number of immigrants to the country. This was the purpose, and it had the desired outcome. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, immigration craters to the United States. Now, this is not just to the quota laws. This is also going to be the Great Depression in the 1930s. There are just fewer people who want to come to the country. There are fewer people who are able to come to the country. So if you couple those two things together, the quota laws with the Great Depression in the 1930s, immigration drops off significantly. There is also another way that this fear of immigrants and others manifests, and that is violence. So Sacco and Vanzetti are two Italian immigrants who are anarchists. They are pretty radical in their political beliefs, and they believe in the destruction of government. How far they're willing to take that is questionable, but they are accused of murder in 1921. And they are found guilty. And eventually they are executed in 1927. This is something that plays out across the whole, or close to it, of the 1920s. Their trial is seen as a referendum on what kind of people we want in the country. And there are many Americans who say that Sacco and Vanzetti are exactly the types of people who we don't want here. But there are others, as you can see in the image, who saw the trial as a show trial, as Sacco and Vanzetti being held to account for the crimes of others, because the evidence was quite sparse. It was just not clear, and so Sacco and Vanzetti were really scapegoats for this fear of immigrants. Eventually, they were executed in 1927 for the crime that they may or may not have committed. Last, the 1920s also see the resurgence of the KKK. The KKK was a group that grew out of the end of the Civil War and the failure of Reconstruction in the South as a way to use fear and the threat of violence to control Black Southerners. This is, late 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. Once the federal government leaves the South after 1877 and federal troops evacuate the South and Jim Crow becomes the law of the land, the KKK declines because the KKK is not seen as necessary by white Southerners. They're just going to use the government to enforce their version of white supremacy on Blacks in the South. In the 20s, we see a resurgence of the KKK, but now it's not going to be in the South. Now it's going to be nationwide. And the KKK is also going to target not just Blacks, but all of these other ethnic and religious groups that you see down here who are seen as threats to white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant America. And this is what the KKK purports to uphold. Blacks, Catholics, Jews, immigrants, foreigners, suspected communists, these are all people who the KKK are going to vilify and argue are un-American. That's their argument, that these people are un-American. we see this throughout the country, and the KKK becomes so powerful that there are millions of KKK members throughout the country. Some so proud of their membership that they march down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., with their hoods removed. So they are removing their anonymity, and they are proudly displaying their beliefs. This should show you the extent to which racism, xenophobia, nativism was not just rampant in the 1920s, but actually accepted in the 1920s. To me, this is why the 1920s are such an interesting era to study, because you have all of these different currents that are running throughout the country. You have modernity, you have people who are having fun and celebrating jazz, but you also have the increase of racism and xenophobia. You have fear, you have worry, you have joy, you have all of this mix in the 1920s. Politically, we have like no mix. Throughout the 1920s, it's a very conservative time. This is our last slide. So I think I'm going to hit that 50 minutes. Am I going to hit that 50 minutes? I think I'm going to do it. The 1920s are a very conservative time politically, especially at the national level, but at the local level and state level as well. There are 3 Republican presidents throughout the 1920s. Each one of them is small government, hands-off, not progressive, in some cases anti-progressive, but more we just want to think of them as not progressive. I'll give you a few things to remember each one of the presidents by. Broadly speaking, however, these presidents are not often asked about on the APUSH exam, but they do show up from time to time. When Harding shows up on the exam, he shows up for the scandals that he is associated with. The Teapot Dome scandal is the most famous of these scandals, where there are federal lands that are given to oil companies at Teapot Dome, and Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, is taking bribes for the leasing of these lands to the oil companies. And so this is the Teapot Dome scandal. The Ohio Gang is a group of Harding's closest friends, advisors, who are also experiencing a number of their own accusations and scandals. So the Harding administration is really known for its scandals. The Fordney-McCumber tariff is also passed during the Harding administration. That's a little less important, but it's context for the Great Depression. America is going to pass a couple tariffs in the lead up to the Great Depression, and these tariffs are seen historically as not good, as helping to create the conditions for the Great Depression. You can see Harding, 1921 to 1923, he dies in office during his first term, and he's replaced by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. Nicknamed Silent Cal, he takes over in 1923, takes the oath of office by candlelight in a cabin in Vermont in 1923. Calvin Coolidge goes on to be elected in 1924 and serves a full term until he leaves office in 1929. So he has 1 term plus because he took over after Harding died suddenly in 1923. And Coolidge, if he's remembered for anything, is remembered for doing very little. Coolidge sent 0 pieces of legislation to Congress in the 5.5 years that he was president. He believed in limited federal government. Now, we could look at Coolidge and say, like, well, this is crazy. Like, this is ridiculous. Why is this guy doing this? He's doing absolutely nothing. But historically, we talked about this in class a little bit, the federal government was a very small entity. And state and local governments were the ones that were supposed to take care of more of the matters of American life. Coolidge sees himself as just returning America to this. These were American values, political values, economic values, cultural values in Coolidge's mind. So his hands-off approach, which many Americans liked because the 20s economically seemed to be going quite well, was what Coolidge was known for. You can make the argument, though, that by doing very little, he helped lead America into the Great Depression. And I think that is an argument that holds a decent amount of water. Had a pet raccoon. Cool fact. Last, Herbert Hoover. And we'll talk a lot about Herbert Hoover next unit, because Hoover is going to be the president when the Great Depression sets in. He takes the oath of office in March of 1929, and he uses his inaugural address to talk about how prosperity is here to stay, and Americans are closer than ever before to solving the problem of poverty. Does not work out. Just a few months later, the stock market crashes and America enters the Great Depression. And that is where we will leave it. It's a good way to end our look at the 1920s, because the market crashes in October of 1929. I encourage you to think more broadly about the 20s, though. Don't just think of it as this time period between World War I and the Great Depression, although they are nice bookends, which I talked about at the beginning of these notes. But really consider the complexities and nuance of the Great Depression, of the 1920s. See, I already have it on my mind. All right, that's it. Did I make it under 50 minutes? I think so. I hope so. See you guys in class.